You talk about hot and spicy and so on. Are we at the end of the road for sriracha? I hope. Or are we going to see more? I still get more sriracha, and there's no flavor.
The thing is that sriracha now is a really good case in point because it shows how much America was desperate for spice. But if you think about the flavor profile of sriracha, it gives you a whole lot of what ketchup gives you with a much bolder flavor profile, but it does give you that sweet, tangy balance that you get from ketchup. So my feeling about sriracha is that it now will just become a mainstay, well, it already has, a mainstay everywhere, so that in the same way that you would not blink twice if you saw ketchup on a table in a medium-priced restaurant, you wouldn't in 10 years, that may be supplanted by sriracha, or it may be in addition to the ketchup. The sriracha would be in addition to the ketchup. So for me, that is a good illustration of what I think is the state of love for spice in the U.S. right now. It's gone from the cult and the fad now to something more mainstream.
I also want to talk about authenticity. And you bring up a really valuable point that your daughter and the millennial generation, what the rules are for authenticity for them are different than it is for the baby boomers or Generation X and so on. And I want to delve into that a little bit. But when I think about Mexican food, and I grew up in New Jersey, okay, so everything was either Italian or Italian. That was the cuisine that you had. You didn't have Mexican. I think we had one Chinese restaurant and one Portuguese restaurant in Newark that my parents would go to once in a while, but it was a long drive and so on. So how has authenticity evolved and changed in Mexican cooking? I mean, not to denigrate any brands, but, again, when I was growing up, it was El Paso.
Right.
That was it. And then we started to see an influx of Goya products, but not too much on the Anglo standpoint. Take us through how Mexican cuisine has evolved.
Okay, so the Mexican-American cuisine is really one thing, and it's completely different than Mexican cuisine. And it's so hard to work in the U.S. because we call Mexican-American food, and then everyone's confused because they come to our restaurant and they go, this isn't Mexican food, but it's the food that the people are eating in Mexico, so I don't know what to call it if it's not Mexican food, okay? So, but we have all this other kind of food in the U.S. that we call Mexican food, and there's the, going back to sort of that older notion of authenticity, there is the cuisine of Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and California. And in the olden days, those were all sort of variations on Mexican food, and they were different regional foods. And then back in the 60s, sort of a new thing emerged, which was kind of chain Mexican, fast food Mexican, and that all sort of came out of Southern California, and then it went all over the United States, and then it went all over the world, basically, because now when you go like to Paris or to Ireland or wherever, people think Mexican food is that version of that chain Mexican restaurant that came out of Southern California in the 60s. And that food has a very distinctive blandness to it, typically. And it has a little bit of the elements of Southwestern cuisine, but not a whole lot. We just opened a new restaurant here in Chicago, of which we are incredibly proud. And it's, talk about sort of a micro focus. It celebrates the cuisine of northern Baja California. Okay, so it's just a really, really small section of Mexico, which is in the upper, like the northwest corner of Mexico, starting from Tijuana all the way down to Ensenada, which is all of a 2-hour drive, and then kind of inland into the major wine growing area of Mexico. So it's a really small area, but there's some of the coolest things in the world happening there with cuisine and wine and so forth. So we have opened this restaurant that has an all wood-fired kitchen, because that's kind of the hallmark of that cuisine. We don't even have a gas hookup in the restaurant. So we have this wood-fired thing, and then a raw bar, basically for ceviches, aguachiles, that sort of thing. And one of the winemakers from Baja was visiting this last week, and they were so thrilled. They had eaten at Frontera Grill the night before, and then they were eating at this new Baja-inspired place called Leña Brava. And they called me over and they go, oh, it's like we never, when we come to the United States, we never eat anything called Mexican food because it always has that taste. And I was like, oh, what do you mean, that taste? And they said, you know, that taste of what goes by Mexican food, or is called Mexican food in the United States. And I was thinking, what is the taste? What is the taste? And then they sort of said, well, you know, that cumin. Okay, so that's, oh, yeah. Okay, so, because in Mexico, they don't really use cumin hardly at all. If they do, it's in the smallest little amounts. And in the United States, if you say, what's Mexican food? People say, oh, it's the stuff where you dump a whole bunch of chilies and cumin in it and you call it Mexican, you know? And so that was one thing. And then they said cumin with bland. And that was what they considered that taste that they didn't like at all. So when you're talking about the difference between Mexican-American food and the cuisine of Mexico, it's a big difference. And the cuisine of Mexico is much more forthright in its flavors. Nothing is compromised. Nothing is sort of like toned down or, as I say, sanitized for your protection. It's not that kind of cuisine. It can be bold. It can be very earthy. It can be very fresh. It can be spicy or not at all, but it's always going to have a vitality to it. And that sort of defines the two different things. Okay, so now, talking about the development of Mexican food over the last number of years in the United States, when you look at the chain restaurants, for instance, they have all become, I'm not sure they've adopted the flavors of Mexico, but they've certainly adopted a whole lot more freshness. Okay, so we get that on the menu. We get some new dishes that are dishes you will find in Mexico that have somehow ended up on their menus, meaning that they've been taking some trips to Mexico to see what people were eating there. Cochinita pibil, the one I was talking about, the pork dish, is now showing up in places that you wouldn't have necessarily ever thought of finding it 10 years ago. We're talking about things like ceviches that have become now like mass market. And with the trend of poke going all crazy across the United States right now, ceviches seem to be like mamby-pamby compared to just a plate of raw fish in front of you. So I think that what we have seen mostly is an awareness that there are regional dishes in Mexico and that we can pay homage to them, sometimes better than others, and that freshness is a real hallmark of Mexican cuisine. So that's what I have seen happen. I'm not sure that everybody in the United States can tell you the difference in flavor between Veracruz-style food and Oaxaca-style food, but I think that now I can assume that people know that there are different dishes that come from different parts of Mexico, and maybe when you've traveled there, even though 90-some% of the American public that goes to Mexico goes only to beach communities, at least they have been introduced to something that perhaps is not just the run-of-the-mill Mexican-American food.